From now on, Israel will act against Hamas with increasing force, and from now on, negotiations will only take place under fire.
The Israeli Prime Minister addressing the recent attacks in Gaza after breaking a truce with Hamas. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Health officials in Gaza say nearly 600 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since Tuesday. This after Israel resumed its assault on Gaza and broke a US-brokered ceasefire deal with Hamas. Now, Jerusalem is also threatening to formally annex the besieged enclave. We begin with this report from CGTN's Jonathan Regev.
Most of those are serving in the army when it comes to prolonged wars, such as the one that practically ended 2 months ago and is now resuming. Most of them are reserves. If they're reserves, many of them have families, have businesses, and they have left them for very long periods before. And just as they seemed as if they were resuming with their normal lives, back to business, back to work, back to healthy family lives, many of them will go back into fighting. Not only that, it happens at a time when there's an immense conflict within Israeli society regarding the Orthodox people and whether they should be conscripted to the army or not. So among those serving, I can say that there's no real appetite. At the same time, there was a feeling over the past few weeks or so that on the one hand there is a ceasefire and there's no combat. On the other hand, nothing seemed to be moving when it came to releasing hostages. It's been nearly 4 weeks now in which there has not been any hostage release, and it was clear that something has to be moving. So Israel is in this very difficult place. On the one hand, no real appetite to return to war, and it's not only the reservists. Millions of Israelis have been reminded of the price of war by running to shelters in the middle of the night. Sirens sounded here in the Tel Aviv area at 4 a.m. local time between Wednesday and Thursday. And again, sirens sounded on Thursday afternoon in the Jerusalem area, in the Tel Aviv area, forcing millions of Israelis to the shelters. So no real appetite for war on the one hand, some kind of solution to the 59 hostages remaining on the other hand, and in between stands the state of Israel, the very divided one, with a very wide divide in its society that has to decide what to do.
Okay, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests in the studio. Joel Rubin is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. And also in the U.S. Capitol, Dan Arbell is a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Dan Arbell, let me start with you. Let's recap what's happened over the past few days. Israel resumed its attacks in Gaza, killing up to 600 people since Tuesday. That happened after Israel violated that ceasefire agreement with Hamas and unilaterally changed the terms of the initial truce. The question now is, why did Israel do that? What is the goal?
Well, good evening, Anand. There's a fierce debate among Israelis about next steps, and clearly Netanyahu tried to reconfigure the arrangement, the deal that was reached in January, trying kind of to get away from his earlier commitment to withdraw the IDF from different parts of Gaza, including the Philadelphia corridor, and also, in a way, bring the war to an end soon. Hamas did not bite, did not accept that, and Israel went into tactics of trying to put pressure on Hamas, and this is the result. We're seeing Israel resuming the fighting in Gaza with the hope that perhaps, with military pressure on Hamas leaders and bases and just in general, different sensitive places in Gaza, then it will bring Hamas back to the table with a willingness to, revisit the issue and perhaps agree to a release of hostages. Hamas, however, is is very reluctant and is not showing any flexibility right now, and the talks are stalled.
Dan, to what extent is what we are seeing now related to domestic politics in Israel, particularly to Prime Minister Netanyahu's effort to stay in power, to keep his fragile coalition together?
Great question. I believe that's very much tied to domestic politics, and it's tied to Netanyahu's effort, first of all, to remain in office, to maintain his coalition intact, as he has these far-right elements in his coalition which are not accepting the idea of ending the war anytime soon. He's promised them not to end the war, and certainly this is a way for him to show that he's living up to his promise, and also deflects attention from other issues that are on the agenda, the investigation into the inner circle of Mr. Netanyahu, different economic problems that Israel is facing, political problems as he's fired the head of Shin Bet, and there's a showdown expected between the judicial branch and the executive branch. And so definitely he believes that, I think that resuming the fighting in Gaza helps him kind of move away or deflect attention from the burning issues of the day, allow him to focus on the war, and that kind of puts the Israeli public in a situation where it's not really responding to other problems that are coming up in this in Netanyahu's administration.
All right, let's bring in Khalil Jahshan. He joins us from right here in Washington, D.C. He is the Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. We're also joined from Oklahoma by Joshua Landis. He is the Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Khalil, I want to get to you first. In addition to resuming the bombing of Gaza over the past few days, Israel has also blocked all humanitarian aid into Gaza. It's, as Dan told us a moment ago, deployed in the Philadelphia corridor, which is on the border between Gaza and Egypt, and closed all border crossings and cut electricity supplies as well. This has affected desalination plants in Gaza, and that has affected the supply of water in that territory. And all this is happening just a few weeks after Egypt announced a multi-billion-dollar package to rebuild Gaza. So where do you see all of this going?
Is this question directed to me?
Yes, Khalil, it is for you, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties hearing you, but I assume you hear me a little bit better than I hear you.
We can hear you.
At any rate, clearly what we have witnessed the past few days and the past couple of weeks, the whole process has collapsed in terms of another or renewed ceasefire deal. Because of differences of opinion in terms of how to proceed. Of course, both sides blame each other. That's understandable in a way. And the U.S. has sided with Israel in essentially putting total blame on Hamas in this regard. But the U.S. has, unfortunately, shifted its strategy from trying to be a third mediator in this process by putting its co-mediators, the other two parties, Arab parties, Egypt and Qatar, in a predicament in a way, and handicapping them by taking full sides with Netanyahu, with Israel. Instead of negotiating phase 2 and phase 3, if you will, of the ceasefire that was reached in January, now what we have is an attempt at a diktat. Take it or leave it. So Hamas has to either accept that diktat, even though it negates the agreement, negates some aspects of the agreement, particularly with regards to full Israeli withdrawal from populated areas and from other security zones in Gaza, and basically begin to talk about an end to this conflict. And Israel is not ready, as we heard from Dan. Most sane Israelis do admit it publicly, that Israel under Netanyahu is not willing to talk about end of war. He made it very clear himself this week, saying that Israel is proceeding forward with this war until it fully achieves its objectives, i.e. Eliminating Hamas totally and basically securing the release of the hostages. His defense minister even went a bit further by saying what you are witnessing is only the beginning, and it's going to be permanent occupation whether you like it or not.
Joel, when this agreement was first announced, President Trump made much of it because he said, look, I brokered this agreement. I brought relative peace to the region.
Right, which was false.
Yeah, well, it was his envoy, Steve Witkoff, who was in Israel and negotiated this. But now Trump is supporting Israel's renewed assault on Gaza. And Benjamin Netanyahu, for his part, says that both Trump and former President Joe Biden have given their full backing to Israel's right to relaunch attacks. As whatever diplomacy is left, what are the United States' options right now?
Well, and I do want to build upon what you mentioned at the beginning, which is that President Trump claimed that he was the man who brought peace to this conflict and the ceasefire on his watch. It was not him, though. It was Joe Biden along with President Trump. There were 8-9 months of intensive diplomacy to get that deal. And what's concerning is that the United States has now seemingly abandoned the field of diplomacy. And so what options are available? There are many options. The first option, of course, is to go back to the parties like Qatar and Egypt and reconvene them and work with the Israelis to find a way out of this dynamic, because this dynamic, as we're discussing, is a war dynamic. It's not a hostage release dynamic. Yeah. This is something I want to really emphasize. The best proof and the best way to get hostages out of Gaza is through diplomatic agreements. There is no military way to have confidence that these hostages can be released. Just ask the hostages, the ones been released and their families. They'll tell you that. So for President Trump, he has many options. He's just choosing to not take them.
But how vital would it be in any future negotiations to make it clear to both sides that if an agreement is signed, both sides have to abide by it?
Well, certainly that's exactly the way it should be, and they were abiding by the agreement up until recent days when Israel decided to break the agreement. Now, the agreement could have been extended. There could have been a continued ceasefire in exchange for aid going into Gaza, but Israel made a decision, Prime Minister Netanyahu made a decision unilaterally that it was time to end the agreement and move forward, and President Trump seems to agree with that position.
Right. Joshua Landis, great to have you with us. There are reports coming from the Middle East that say that Hamas is ready to accept any proposal to release Israeli hostages if it includes the reinstatement of the ceasefire. But point is this what's going on right now? Is it about the release of the hostages or Benjamin Netanyahu's political career?
Well, I think it is about Benjamin Netanyahu's political career, but it's also about the larger ambitions of a greater Israel and his coalition. And it's not just his coalition. I think that if one goes back to the beginnings of Netanyahu's career, he was determined not to allow for a two-state solution, not to allow for the Palestinians to build a state. He believes deeply in a greater Israel, as do many of the ministers in his government. And I think that this is a matter of a legacy for his life's work. And he's gotten very close to accomplishing. He's destroyed Hezbollah. He's got Iran pinned back. He's hoping that he can convince the United States to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. And he doesn't want to have an Arab plan enacted. And he certainly doesn't want Hamas to still be to still have fighters and to be active at the end of this. So total victory for him means pressing forward with the fight. And there isn't really a vision for what's going to happen to the Palestinians. I think whatever vision it is, it's very dark for the Palestinians. And we saw President Trump try to wish the Palestinians away to Jordan and Egypt. And that, of course, gratified many in Netanyahu's coalition. And I think they're still hoping that some kind of solution along those lines might end this for them once and for all. And that would be the solution of a greater Israel. And we're seeing it in the West Bank as well. This isn't just Gaza.
The effort to prevent Hamas from having any role in Gaza has been stated by the Israelis, by Prime Minister Netanyahu, Joshua, as one of the goals of this assault on the enclave. But I just want to get your thoughts on a question I asked Joel a moment ago, and that is, what options do the United States have right now? It seems that, both sides are working on very different understandings of the ceasefire agreement, and we had the U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who said on the social media platform X, he said the ceasefire would have continued if Hamas had released all hostages, but instead Hamas had chosen war. But it wasn't Hamas that broke the ceasefire.
Correct. This is not... This is not about who broke the ceasefire. President Trump has backed Netanyahu at every turn, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Syria, now, whether it's in the West Bank, and now in Gaza. He isn't going to get into an arm wrestling match with Netanyahu. I think he's decided that what's important for him and his presidency and the Republican Party in the United States is to back Israel wholeheartedly in whatever struggle it's going to get into, whether that's in Lebanon or in Syria or in Gaza or in the West Bank. So I don't see the United States sweeping in and saving the Palestinians in any way, shape, or form.
Dan Arbell, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, he is now threatening to annex parts of Gaza if the remaining hostages are not released. Clearly, the message there is that Israel is not too concerned about expanding what is happening in Gaza right now. Then, of course, we had this headline in the Financial Times, which said Israel's forever war, that's what the Financial Times calls it, the forever war stretches the IDF to the limit. How can Israel sustain this war indefinitely?
So, Defense Minister Katz's statement comes several weeks after similar words articulated by the Finance Minister, Smotrich, who's on the far right. And the idea is basically that if Hamas continues with its firing of rockets, continues to be persistent, and not agree to return to the negotiating table, then on each kind of refusal of Hamas, then Israel would take steps to annex a small piece of land in the northern Gaza Strip and move its way up. But I honestly don't think that this is a feasible plan, and I think that this is something that may take place, like kind of a symbolic measure, or perhaps taking of a small territory just to kind of flex the muscle or to show that Israel is serious. But I don't think that, seriously, Israel is entertaining the idea of returning to Gaza or reestablishing Israeli presence there, or let alone rebuilding Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. And as you said, certainly the IDF is stretched out, and reservists, like your correspondent has reported on, are already, some of them are returning for after several hundred days of service, here for another round of service. This is very, very, this is a strain certainly on the reserve duty soldiers. It's hurting their businesses. And again, people are also don't fully understand, Israelis don't really understand what Netanyahu is trying to achieve. And where is he going with this? And I do expect that there will be a greater reluctance on the part of reserve duty soldiers to re-enlist or to do active army service again, as long as they're not convinced that these goals are either legitimate or effective.
Khalil, Jahshan, Israel Katz also said this in the wake of these renewed attacks that we are seeing. Let's listen to him.
Residents of Gaza, this is the last warning. The first Sin War destroyed Gaza, and the second Sin War will destroy it completely. The airstrike against Hamas terrorists was only the first step. What is coming will be more difficult, and you will pay the price. Soon, the evacuation of residents from combat zones will begin again. If they don't return the Israeli hostages and Hamas is not being removed from Gaza, Israel will act with force like you haven't seen before.
So, Khalil, a very stark, a very dark warning there from the Israeli defense minister. But if this is a tactic to get the rest of the hostages released, will it work?
I don't think so, because frankly, this type of statement is not the first such Israeli statement. We've heard it several times from his predecessor, even though he wasn't necessarily as far to the right as Katz is. But this is kind of a typical condescending statement by an Israeli defense official toward the Palestinians. The only good Palestinians are the ones where I stand with my foot on their neck, and they basically accept my diktat. Frankly, it didn't work for 17 months, and that's why Israel continues today, 17 months later, to continue to insist that it has to finish the job. Well, what the hell has it done for 17 months? What happened to the job? If they couldn't finish the job in 17 months, they are not going to finish it in 17 years. Number two, if you take even, one of the kids today, 5, 6, 10-year-old kid in Gaza who didn't survive, unlike maybe 18 or 19,000 other kids who perished during the Israeli attacks over the past 17 months. That kid is not going to be impressed by this type of talk because they have been hearing it all their lives. And so at the same time, Israel, I think, is just intoxicated with its own verbosity. Mm-hmm. I agree with Dan that probably it's not part of their strategy to do what Katz is saying, that he wants permanent occupation of Gaza, because they can't do it, frankly, even if they try. But at the same time, one cannot forget Israel's insatiable appetite for land. The situation itself might dictate a solution on Israel that it's not even planned, that they will end up getting stuck in a way. Gaza again will be Israel's Vietnam.
Joel, Joshua Landis told us a moment ago that the future looks very dark for Palestinians right now, and he doesn't expect the United States under Trump to come to their rescue at any point. But could that change with domestic sentiment in the United States?
Well, I think domestic sentiment clearly impacted President Biden over the last year plus, and of course Kamala Harris.
Did it impact him negatively?
I think what it did is it undermined actually their viability in the election. I believe that the Democratic base really took out a lot of anger at the president, and now ushered in Donald Trump, who's much more hostile to Palestinian aspirations. And so I don't think it's going to affect President Trump. Quite frankly, the most important domestic politics are the Israeli domestic politics. And what's very interesting about this moment is that now, for the first time during this war, we're actually seeing the convergence of the pre-October 7th Israel and the post-October 7th Israel. Remember, Yahya Sinwar, when he launched that attack, he was calculating that Israel would be divided. It was divided politically. There were protests over a year and a half ago against judicial reform being led by Netanyahu. And so he thought, well, they'll break. Well, he was wrong then. But now we're seeing protests coming out onto the street about these judicial questions or investigations and the hostage families. So interestingly, it's the Israeli people themselves. They are the most important decision makers in this process.
There were also demonstrations on the streets over the dismissal of the intelligence minister.
That's right. Well, Ronen Bar, who is leading an investigation into was leading an investigation into Prime Minister Netanyahu related to possible corruption. He has now been pushed out, and that, of course, is a bad sign for democracy in Israel, and that is also a motivator for street protests that we see in a lower level than in the past, but still they are now out there.
Joshua Landis, I think it's fair to say that the United States is marching in lockstep with Israel when it comes to what Israel is doing right now. But what about the Europeans? Do they have any role to play? Do they have any leverage at all?
They don't have much leverage, but we are seeing Europeans beginning to separate from the United States on a whole host of issues, not only NATO and Ukraine, but also on questions like Syria, Lebanon, and now I think increasingly on Israel. But they don't have any leverage in this situation. All the arms that are provided to Israel come from the United States. The backing in the UN Security Council comes from the United States. So I don't think that Europe is going to want to get into this issue. It is America's baby, and there will be public criticism. There's no doubt about it that we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism around the world. But Israel has faced into those things in the past, and has not let itself be intimidated by that public opinion in the West. So, and we're seeing in the United States that President Trump is being able to really clobber the pro-Palestinian efforts by students on campuses. It's really been squelched across the United States on campuses. So Israel has a lot of leeway, and I agree with Joe. It's going to be up to the Israeli people and their appetite for how far they want to push the Palestinians and how far their government can push the Palestinians, because this issue just isn't going to go away. Even if there is a temporary truce in Gaza, the place is boiling. There is no resolution without a two-state solution, or without driving them out of the country. And that doesn't seem like a possibility today. The Trump idea just didn't catch, and so they're stuck, and there isn't a good solution.
Right.
And I think Israel's beginning to realize that.
Okay, Dan Arbell, very quickly, I've only got about 40 seconds. Egypt has presented a new proposal for another ceasefire. This would also include the release of the American-Israeli hostage, Idan Alexander, along with the remains of 5 other hostages. Do you think that could go anywhere?
So I think that a lot depends on Hamas's willingness to do it, and I just don't see that happening anytime soon unless Hamas is presented with a broader quid pro quo, a plan that would also give Hamas some gains. Just like that, this plan I don't think will be accepted by Hamas.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.